Today, I have stood where once Jefferson Davis stood and took an oath to my people. It is very appropriate that from this cradle of the Confederacy, this very heart of the great Anglo-Saxon Southland, that today we sound the drum for freedom, as have our generation of forebears before us done time and again down through history. Let us rise to the call of freedom-loving blood that is in us and send our answer to the tyranny that clanks its chains upon the South. In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Hello, dear listeners, friends, comrades, subjects, citizens, insurgents, fugitives, defectors, dissidents, even the haters and losers. Welcome to Turbulence. My name is Dylan Saba, and I'm here with my co-host, Seamus Melikafzeli, along with our producer, M. Siniza. We're recording from New York City, the center of a world empire that is dying but so far from dead.
America's 250th has come and gone without much fervor, a supposedly momentous achievement in national survival, one that at least I had personally assumed when I was much younger would be a gigantic event. There was a pathetic fair on the National Mall, chintzy memorabilia struck for the occasion, and it felt even less important than your average July 4th celebration, a deflated affair that deserved nothing but derision. The reason for most of this was obvious. The 250th was heavily associated with Trump and his personal image, but it's not as if he and the fervor around American institutions sprang out of nowhere.
In a certain sense, Trump reflects the worst of America. The conviction that America is exceptional because it is the strongest, richest, most powerful nation, and that American freedom is the freedom to dominate others and to maintain that status by force. But while he is particularly crude in asserting this, Trump is not some monstrous perversion of American values. Instead, he represents the morbid symptoms of an empire running up against the hard limits of expansion.
If we think about the mess of the world that we find ourselves in now, the U.S. waging war in Iran, the genocide in Gaza continuing, Venezuela having been functionally reduced to a vassal state, none of it began with the current administration. The groundwork for all of these disasters were laid by a sequence of American leaders, not just Republicans, but many of them also Democrats, who were all fighting to sustain the hegemony of the United States on the global stage.
I spent the 4th of July thinking about what that fight has meant over the long arc of our country's history. I don't know if you saw Trump's speech on the night of July 3rd, but it was really something. He was standing underneath Rushmore. Clearly, he feels like he ought to be the fifth face carved on that mountain, and he declared communists to be the enemies of 1776. But as he stated in the speech, and as Rubio later emphasized in the State Department report on Cuba, this wasn't really about economic policy, but about the inheritors of Western civilization. Communists, Trump clarified, are the people who tell you that conquest is wrong. It was a wild thing to say, and a wild place to say it. Rushmore, Mount Rushmore, is carved into the Black Hills of South Dakota, a holy site for the Sioux Indians, and the site of some of the fiercest indigenous resistance to the U.S.'s settler imperialism. I thought about how across each successive era of American history, different peoples have taken up that mantle, the enemies of 1776. The Sioux, the Tagalog insurgency in the Philippines, the Viet Cong, the Palestinian resistance, just to name a few. And how, in a certain respect, the US has been fighting the same war of conquest over and over since its founding. To help us think through that broader story, how it has shaped American identity, and what it would mean to transcend that lineage, we are joined today by Aziz Rana. Aziz Rana is a professor of law and government at Boston College Law School. He is the author of 2 books, The Two Faces of American Freedom, and his most recent book, The Constitutional Bind, How Americans Came to Idealize a Document That Fails Them. And I have to say, I was very excited to get to do this interview. As you might imagine, I really struggled to stay grounded when I was in law school. Throughout my legal education, I was being exposed to the very infrastructure of domination, of centuries of race and class war waged by the ruling class. I found it extremely radicalizing, but most of the people around me didn't really seem to notice. Rana was one of the few legal academics I found who seemed to understand the true implications of the United States as a legal and national form. So it was very much an honor to get to speak with him today.
Before we get into the conversation, we do have a pitch to you, the listener. Turbulence is entirely listener-funded. We don't run ads. We don't take money from institutions. And that independence is the foundation of this project. It only exists because of you.
Because we're committed to providing you the in-depth history and present context you need to make sense of each of these topics, these episodes take a great deal of time and effort to produce, from conception to research to editing. It's because we value your time as a listener, and because we want to produce something lasting and useful, that we think this level of effort is worth investing in. But that means we can't quite move as nimbly as we might otherwise like. So in addition to our free public episodes, we're also dropping weekly episodes behind the paywall. That's where we'll be able to respond to events as they unfold in closer to real time, providing our analysis, following up on threads and conversations from prior episodes, and drawing connections across the topics we've covered.
To do all this, we need your support. A $5 monthly subscription will give you access to the bonus feed, our Substack community, and most importantly, you'll make it possible for us to keep doing this work independently week after week. Subscribe today at turbulencepod.substack.com and follow along on Twitter and Instagram at turbulence_pod. We hope you'll join us.
Hello and welcome. Today we are joined by Aziz Rana. Aziz Rana is a professor of law and government at Boston College Law School, where his teaching focuses on American constitutional law and political development. He is the author of 2 books. One, The Two Faces of American Freedom, and his most recent book, the magisterial, if I might add, The Constitutional Bind, How Americans Came to Idealize a Document That Fails Them. Aziz, thank you so much for joining us on Turbulence.
It's great to be on the show. Thanks so much for having me.
So I'd like to start by discussing how you are viewing the broader arc of Trump's foreign policy in his second term. From his approach to Gaza, to the Venezuela operation, to this current war in Iran, and his blockade and military threats against Cuba, we're seeing what is arguably a transformation in the form of American power. Rather than presenting itself as the guarantor of an international order, the United States increasingly seems to be operating like a shakedown operation, using tariffs, sanctions, the threat and actual use of military force as instruments of overt coercion and extraction, seemingly not so much to manage the US's long-term interests, but to enrich whatever faction of the elite happen to have strings to pull with the White House. In your recent Boston Review essay, which you co-authored with Asla Bali, you argue that what we're seeing isn't so much a rupture with the post-war order as maybe something like the culmination of longer-running trends within it. A shift away from the rules-bound liberal internationalism towards something that is more openly coercive and transactional as a mode of empire. Can you just talk a little bit about how you see that shift and that transition?
Sure. So I think the best way to think about this moment is as both rupture, genuine rupture from the post-war, quote unquote, rules-based order, but then also really profound continuity or culmination as you described. And oftentimes there are basically two frames that are presented for the present. So frame number one is that Trump is just a rejection of this vision of liberal internationalism that shaped American authority, rejection of the rules of international law, the idea of the rule of law itself. And then on the other side, you have folks, especially on the left, that say, well, wait a second, this seems pretty continuous with a long history of American imperialism from gunboat diplomacy all the way through to the backing of various dictators and coups and assassinations during the Cold War. And in a way, I think both are correct. And so I think it's useful to just sort of appreciate the extent to which we're probably entering a kind of third era when thinking about American foreign policy since 1945. So if we think about the immediate post-war period, really what you see is that the U.S. finds itself as a dominant global player in a context in which it's defining its own international authority, especially against the backdrop of a confrontation with the Soviet Union, precisely through the international rules that it's establishing. And what this means is that the thought is that the reason why the U.S. has the legitimacy to sort of oversee the global order is because its essential essence is constitutional, a respect for something like constitutional democracy. And so when it promotes its own national interests, security interests, it's promoting the principle of constitutional democracy, which is really the interest of all. Its material interests are the interests of all. But from the very beginning, there was always a question about, well, in this international system that's supposed to be based on multilateral institutions, various forms of mutual constraint, who's supposed to ensure that threats to the order are actually addressed? And the American argument is that precisely because of American exceptionalism, that it alone is actually worthy of having that kind of authority because its essence is this commitment to constitutionalism. And so from the very beginning, what we saw with the US was both the establishment of a set of rules, but then also the persistent violation of those rules, but precisely in the name of sustaining the system. So that the US establishes, operates within the rules, but then claims a kind of unilateral right to step outside of them in order to be able to impose what it views as a kind of a security-enhancing violence. And this means that, as a matter of fact, like the period of the Cold War, which was supposed to be the heyday of the liberal international order, was nonetheless a period of really extreme violence carried out by the U.S., as well as U.S. complicity in a whole host of practices, including things like, what scholars have described as a genocide in places like Indonesia. And so that sort of defines, let's say, the 45 to the 89 period. And then with the collapse of the Soviet Union, what happens is that U.S. enjoys truly like unipolar dominance. And at least initially, the thought is, and you can see this with the first Gulf War, and also with the establishment of institutions like the World Trade Organization, that this is going to introduce a new era of multilateralism supervised by the U.S. But instead, the lack of there being any kind of external competitor produces a situation where the U.S. is increasingly like defecting from the rules themselves as just a more systematic matter. So, for instance, the U.S. plays a central role in establishing the ICC, in writing the text of the Rome Statute. But then when it comes time to actually ratify it as a treaty in the U.S., basically the U.S. refuses to be bound by it. And then especially post 9/11, what you start seeing is systematic rules defection. And there are some periods where you have, greater commitment to multilateralism, rule following. We see this, for instance, perhaps the high tide of it would be the effort to produce a nuclear deal under the Obama administration with Iran. But at the same time, even under the Obama administration, you have the rise of targeted killings, drone strikes, would amount to, assassinations by another name. And then, of course, this is all really further underscored during the Biden administration by the U.S.'s complicity in which legal scholars, historians, UN experts have all now effectively labeled as a genocide in Gaza. And so that you have this period of sustained defection. And then really what the Trump administration amounts to is in the context of sustained defection from the set of rules. Now, what the Trump administration is effectively engaged in is a direct assault on the rules themselves. So it's not just that the US believes that it is exempt, but the US understands these rules as a threat to its own sovereign capacity to be able to supervise its sphere of influence, which it understands basically to be the Americas, the Western Hemisphere, and the Middle East as part of its own near abroad. And so it's not just, for instance, taking the ICC example as illustrative, that the US will not sign up to a statute that it played a central role in writing. But now the US is engaged in an effort to sanction the judges, to destroy the institution, and more generally, to destroy the institutions effectively of the post-war multilateral order to the extent that those are viewed as inconsistent with the American ability to assert control over what it takes to be its sphere. And this really is a much more sustained rejection of the post-45 order and the post-45 vision of how American power operates within it. It's much more compatible to really a return to late 19th and early 20th century notions of empire and really European empire that's framed through distinct civilizational peoples that are engaged in various forms of confrontation with powerful states having their own spheres of influence. And so what we're seeing is really a foreign policy built not on the vision of the US as exceptional for its constitutional commitments, but a foreign policy built on the idea of the world divided among dominant regional hegemons that are effectively authoritarian and that supervise their own spheres.
I'm curious, so you mentioned that first period of the post-war era as ending in 1989. You said 45 to 89. Is that because you view the invasion of Panama as the first act of that next phase of US exemptionalism?
Well, I mean, you can definitely see there's examples like Panama, and then through the 90s, there's a variety of different kinds of unilateral actions, including, what happens in Kosovo. I was just broadly thinking of like the Cold War period, where to me, I think it's really significant that the US had not just a material competitor for power. So this is, today there's talk about a quote unquote new Cold War with China. It's a material competitor for power when it comes to economic authority, military authority. But the Soviet Union was also an ideological competitor. It was a competitor when it comes to like a vision of how the world should be organized. And at a very specific historical moment in time, which is the collapse of the European empires following World War II, where even the victors of World War II, like England, no longer had the capacity, just because of how devastating these two world wars were, to sustain imperial management globally. And so you have decolonization, independence movements, and the US vying with a Soviet antagonist over hearts and minds across the global South, where the stakes weren't just spheres of influence, but also a kind of ideological vision of how the world should be organized. And the collapse of the Soviet Union, I think, played a really profound role in kind of reshaping the terms of American power. And one of the things that it did is that for American national elites, it removed a significant constraint that had played a key role in why American national elites were willing not just to defect from the rules as they did throughout the Cold War period, but also to invest in multilateral institutions, to invest in not just the drafting of treaties, but the establishment of agencies like USAID, the sort of like the building of soft power, where the rules, foreign investment and aid, this was all about generating consent and buy-in to an American order built around a default rule that was marked by kind of market capitalism and some version of liberal governance. And so the collapse of the Soviet Union, I think, plays a significant role in eliminating one of the central structural sort of incentives behind this kind of complicated balance between rules commitment and investment and rules defection. And then what happens really with the collapse of the Soviet Union is that as a matter of American foreign policy, you start seeing much more sustained defection, even as Americans are still really deeply invested in the narrative of the country as exceptional. So if you tell the story of everything from, frankly, like Panama to Kosovo to the era of humanitarian interventions to post 9/11 to the Iraq War, the justifications for practices that are themselves defections from the rules is that this is necessary to sustain a global world premised on constitutional democracy. But what you're not seeing is really like a commitment to American rule following in sort of like a systematic way, or a kind of material investment in multilateral institutions and the provision of like financial resources across the globe. So like financial aid as a percentage of GDP declines pretty significantly. The US involvement in many of the institutions that it had previously been committed to, you see massive declines as well. And that's a pretty profound difference. And I should say, as another thing, this is also having domestic effects on American politics. That in many ways, the Trump moment is a product specifically of, and we can talk a little bit about this, the real failures and weaknesses of American democratic institutions, but then also the cultural dynamics on the American right, where Trump and the people around Trump reject pretty much out of hand the story of American liberal hegemony, quote unquote, post-World War II. They're investing really in a rejection of the 20th century and a return to a kind of ethno-national civilizational vision of American authority. And a significant part of that, I also think, has to do with how the end of the Cold War unshackled some of the constraints on the American right. There are many different elements of it, but a long-term effect was that Cold War dynamics didn't just produce repression, McCarthyite crackdowns on the left in the US, but Cold War dynamics also created incentives for the right to view various kinds of accommodations on issues of race, so racial liberalism, on issues of material distribution, something like a limited social welfare state, as national security imperatives to win hearts and minds domestically and globally in the context of a Cold War. There's a reason why Republican votes were involved in things like the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And then basically, I think what happens over time, and then especially with the end of the Cold War, is that the kinds of right-wing constraints that contained the long-standing views about ethno-racial dominance, what we would call white nationalism, extreme versions of market orthodoxy, extreme forms of belligerence when it comes to how you imagine the world. The US is a kind of fortress surrounded by enemies. Those views, which had always been quite powerful on the right, really came back with a vengeance in a context in which the internal structural constraints that were also generated by the global system between 45 and 89 collapsed. And over time, that, for a variety of reasons maybe we can talk about, ended up basically transforming the nature of conservative politics in the US, claiming one of the two political parties, and set the terms for why when Trump returns in 2024, 2025, the dominant perspective of the foreign policy is a perspective that really in many ways is this rejection of the 20th century and a return to a vision of the US not unlike the vision of the US at the end of the 19th, early 20th, which is as a regional, dominant settler hegemon understood in ethno-racial terms, supervising a sphere of influence.
I'm wondering if we could maybe get a little bit more granular with these ideological roots of that specific malignant Trumpian worldview. Because, I mean, we're talking about the ranges of time, just how far back these kinds of things might go back to the 19th century. But I think when you talk to liberals, especially during the first Trump term, in which I was painfully and shamefully young, there is a tendency to attribute those viewpoints to this very sudden and improbable shift, like it came out of the sky and it completely hijacked the organization from its real power base, which apparently didn't believe this thing, this belief that individuals like John Kasich or even Marco Rubio, being seen as moderates at the time, those were the real Republicans. And I'm wondering if you could maybe be more specific about when did this view of the outside world start taking root so that when it was unleashed by the end of the Cold War, it was just ready to go?
Yeah, so I think there are a few different things to be said. So the first is some combination of what's called economic populism or populism, anti-elitism, and ethno-nationalism probably is among the deepest rooted ideological formations in the US that, goes back all the way to the founding, and we can talk a little bit about this. So that if we just think about folks like Jefferson and Jackson all the way to George Wallace, I mean, this is a very powerful strain within American politics. And for a variety of reasons that we can discuss, some of them having to do with the successes of the New Deal order in terms of expanding the economic base for like working class and white working class in the mid-20th century, some of it having to do with the World War II and the Cold War, as well as the way in which like World War II and the US's global dominance had really massive beneficial economic effects domestically in the US, that you can see this 30 to 40 year period, the 30s to the 70s, where that perspective faces real sustained cultural and political pushback, such that by the time, like if you're like me, so I was in high school and college in the 90s, that it almost seems like, an anachronistic holdover from a different era. Thinking about Andrew Jackson and George Wallace as part of a powerful, sustained tradition feels like it's done because of the contingent dynamics that produced mid-century American political accommodations. So it's always been there. It's always been powerful. It was submerged for various reasons because of these confrontations. And then I'd say that if you just look at American politics over the last half century, there've been a series of various kinds of shocks to the system that really destabilized what had been the kind of mid-20th century compact and created the conditions both for the revival of, left democratic socialist politics, but then also for the revival of this particular tradition. And I would just note, let's say, a handful of them. The first, I think, that has to be highlighted is really the collapse of the manufacturing base and the change in the nature of the American economy starting in the early 1970s. And one of the things that this did is it begins a long transformation in the nature of working class identity and politics that plays a central role along with like really the decline of union power and density. So you get to a place where workers are private employees or the organization numbers are 6%. Unions are incredibly weak institutionally, but also as like a cultural force. There's the changes in the nature of the economy. And so the kinds of institutional and cultural formations that had made possible a particular combination of racial liberalism and social welfarism really breaks down. And so the house that had made it plausible for members of quote unquote white working class or white middle class to be funneled into a mid-century compact starts to disappear. So that has, I think, a pretty big effect on creating greater floating numbers of folks that are open to different types of political perspectives. The next thing I think is the collapse of the Soviet Union, which unleashes the right. And so like the right's politics moves in an increasingly more aggressively reactionary direction across a whole range of issues. Nativist, the politics of, again, white nationalism, a suspicion that multiracial democracy is itself a kind of existential threat to the power of like an ethno-racial base. So there's all of that. Then there's also, I think, the next key element is sort of the long-term effects of the war on terror and the various kind of like forever wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, where these sort of crack a type of bipartisan consensus around American foreign policy in the Middle East and elsewhere, but they have different implications for right and left. I think one of the implications on the right, and this is something that Trump was able to take advantage of, is the idea that the US should not be in these international conflicts because folks are like ethno-racially distinct and there are people out there in the world that are not capable of essentially understanding American freedom. And so that the natural reaction to the failures basically of the US's response post 9/11 is essentially a version of a kind of belligerent retreat to the borders through like harsh border controls and an extreme assertion of various kinds of like ethno-nationalist politics, including Islamophobia. So there's that. Then there's the financial crisis in '08. And what the financial crisis does is it really undermines the legitimacy of what had been the post-'70s like centrist economic consensus built around what's sometimes called neoliberalism, but privatization, deregulation. And all of that creates like profound forms of discontent that are like further stoked later on by COVID, health pandemics, but that occur at a very specific kind of historical moment where you have all of this latent discontent, but you have the institutions of the center left, and especially the institutions that had been associated with social welfarism like unions, incredibly weak. And so the right is kind of situated to sort of claim a lot of disaffection just because of like the way it is organized collectively, the kind of money that exists on the right, the type of populist sentiment that can be tied to old-fashioned assertions about ethnic nationalism, anti-immigrant politics, harsh border controls, etc. And then this all intersects with the rise of Trump because of like sort of like the final piece of this, which is in the US specifically, you see these dynamics globally, but in the US specifically, you also have constitutional arrangements that are highly undemocratic, that because our system is based on geography and not the principle of one person, one vote, small population centers that are the base of like the far right are dramatically overrepresented. And so that gives the capacity to somebody like Trump, even if he doesn't have majority support, but has a durable base to be able to come to power. And then because of the weaknesses of the institutions, return to power even after he attempts effectively to subvert a democratic election in 2020. And so that the return is in a context in which over the course of half a century, through like the 70s collapse of industrial capitalism, the end of the Cold War, the way in which the right reacts to the failures of the forever wars, the collapse of faith in a kind of neoliberal consensus post '08, and then the way in which Trump is able to take advantage of like the institutions of governance, you see an incredibly emboldened far right, but one that I think pretty clearly has a political orientation that looks very little like quote unquote traditional Republican politics. And so in a way, the folks like Jack Ryan or Kasich become people without a home, so that there's still like a powerful part of like the intellectual class. You can see their views represented in magazines like The Atlantic, but they don't have anything like the kind of mass base that somebody like Trump and the people around Trump can marshal.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up George Wallace at the very beginning there, because when I was growing up, when I was taught about George Wallace, there was this great emphasis on the fact that he was anti-segregation and he had all these negative effects on domestic policy. But that '68 presidential campaign, so much of it was based around his vice presidential candidate, Curtis LeMay, who advocated this outrageous foreign policy regarding the invasion of Cuba and using nuclear weapons to essentially kowtow the rest of the world under the American military footprint. And that overrepresentation that you're talking about allows the Wallace campaign to exercise this undue amount of power over the course of the election.
Yeah, can I just add something on this?
Please.
You know, you can see Wallace as an interesting kind of precursor to various elements of like Trumpian politics, because there's the white nationalism, the defense of segregation. So there's all of that politics. There's also the fact that it's the Wallace campaign is a very strong appeal to what had been classic Democratic Party voters, so working class voters, union voters. And so that there's a populist dimension, including with sort of like framed as around some of the elements of the New Deal with Wallace. You know, here we can see that economic populism is really being submerged, but it's there with J.D. Vance, Steve Bannon, et cetera. And then that last point, which is, you know, Wallace is committed to an incredibly belligerent version of the U.S.'s role in the world. And it's why I think it's always been a mistake to think of, quote unquote, America First or Trump's opposition, though he initially supported it, to things like the Iraq War as anti-militarist or isolationist, because it clearly is not. really the claim is that the US should be behind this fortress, and that to the extent that it's engaged in foreign policy practices, the purpose, and you can see this in the national security strategy from the end of 2025, is to assert dominance. And to assert dominance through violence and belligerency because of the idea that we live in a world of might makes right. And that the world should be divided based on these like different, powers and ethno-national civilizations. And so it's perfectly consistent, for instance, to, on the one hand, be engaged in, imperial violence vis-a-vis Venezuela or Cuba. So essentially engaged in extrajudicial killings on the high seas, or kidnapping an official, or blockading an entire economy, or seizing assets and determining how a country uses its oil. So old-fashioned empire, while at the same time saying that we're attempting to kind of retreat from being the policeman of the world. And this is where I think one of the real internal tensions or contradictions with the Trump administration, I think, plays out. And this has to do with how to make sense of something like Iran, which is, I think that basically what happened with Iran is that Trump thought, so this is, everybody's just guessing, but I think that Trump basically thought this was not a confrontation with a peer. It's not attacking Russia. It's not attacking China. This is much more like Venezuela, where you can just assert dominance and engage in the same kind of playbook, treating the Middle East as effectively your own near abroad. But you can do this while at the same time still engaging in this hoped, quote unquote, like pivot to East Asia, where you see the main folks that you have to contain or understand yourself as in a kind of equilibrium as the other great powers, Russia, China. You control your own hemisphere, and you engaged in imperial conduct in your own hemisphere. And I think the thing that happened was like a massive miscalculation, so that not only the pivot to Asia, but this sort of vision of dominance asserted against those below you, so like a kind of bullying, punching down, just essentially didn't play out. And so now Trump is trapped in a confrontation with a political enemy or opponent that is able to assert, countervailing forms of military authority. But it's a very different thing. The reason why I make this point is you can be a neocon, as many neocons were, and think, hey, the US should be engaged after invading Iraq in going and invading Iran, because you're interested in reconstructing the Middle East and ultimately the globe on terms of American dominance based on a kind of really muscular version of this post-45 idea of American exceptionalism. That's, I don't think, what's happening with like Trump. Like, I don't think Trump is an ideologically committed neocon. He's not ideologically committed to really anything, probably including to the US's relationship with Israel in the way that somebody like Biden might have been. But he effectively, I think, mistook Iran's position and sort of imagined what he was doing was the kind of sort of belligerence that's part of US asserting its dominance in its own sphere that can look like retrenchment, but actually proceed in ways that are incredibly violent and aggressive.
I'm glad you brought up Iran, because something that I've brought up in discussions with Dylan on this program is the difference between the discussions that happened under Obama with Iran and the discussions that happened under Trump. And that when the JCPOA was being negotiated, the Obama administration, when they were dealing with issues of extraordinary detail with the negotiators, quantum physicists, the Obama administration respected them as a peer and brought in other nuclear scientists, other quantum physicists to discuss that level of detail with the other party. And here, in addition to this total destruction of the State Department's capabilities, all forms of expertise in the Middle East, there is this open disdain and disgust with having to speak with the Iranians at all. Sending real estate moguls and the president's son-in-law to demand essentially that Iran dismantle its navy, ship all of its uranium outside, all of that. And all of this is to say, this return to those politics of expertise and so-called restraint, because as you've said, a lot of the things that happened under Obama led to where we are now. Is that kind of return to Obamaism even possible anymore? The kind of things that Democrats are after right now.
Yeah, so I'm pretty skeptical. I'm skeptical for two different reasons. So the first is that I think it's really important to highlight the extent to which the story of the defection from the rules is a long story again. So this is the way in which Trump's behavior is pretty continuous. In some ways, the Obama negotiations around the JCPOA is really a post-89 and like especially post 9/11 outlier in terms of that kind of sustained investment in both respect for like an international treaty with the Non-Proliferation Treaty and also investment in multilateral decision-making to reach a mutually beneficial outcome. It's very much a manifestation of like a way of thinking about how the international community should be organized that's pretty inconsistent with how U.S. foreign policy has proceeded, certainly over the last 25 years, and also sort of undermined by a number of other things that Obama did during his time in office, including, for instance, the use of targeted killings, drone strikes in the context of the war on terror. But then it's also the case that Trump, abandoned the deal, and Biden, as president, even though there was talk about returning to the negotiating table, essentially refused to reclaim the deal as well. And so by the time we get to this kind of Trump administration, there's been just like a long history of essentially failing to abide by the commitments that the U.S. has engaged in. I worry that at a structural level, if the idea is the U.S. should return to thinking of itself as the first among equals, that establishes the rules, but that can always step outside the rules so as to ensure that the system sustains itself. Like the legacy isn't just the JCPOA. The legacy is really the story since 45 and certainly the story since 9/11 in the Middle East, which is one of extensive forms of violence that end up being authorized because there's a fundamental contradiction. The U.S. says that its interests are the interests of the world. This is like the Obama position. But if those interests are access to regional oil, ensuring the military hegemony and dominance of Israel, containing Iran, then what they've actually done is generate and defend and have the U.S. complicit in pretty extreme forms of violence. So I don't see it as something that is sustainable as a way of actually creating a world that's premised on reduced forms of violence, multilateral decision-making constraints. So that's one issue. But then I think there's a second one, which is we're just not living in 2015. So the worry I have, even if you have more chastened Democrats that come back and that say, okay, we shouldn't have done what we did in terms of how the Biden administration provided a blank check to Israel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that we should have committed to these various policies, that the approach that I see from this version of the foreign policy establishment in DC is that, well, what we just need is a moral reset. So if we just say we're going to be better, then all of a sudden that's going to have this transformative effect. And I just don't think it will either domestically or internationally. Like internationally, it's very hard to believe that anybody will take U.S. commitments as serious. Like they won't have credibility. Like you just can't return back to 2015, because you have the experience of the last decade. And you also have the profound instabilities of American institutions, legal political systems, so that folks know that a Democrat might be replaced with another version of like the far right. So there's nothing that the U.S. says that can claim that kind of credibility. But it's also that the U.S. has effectively reached a point now where when it comes to its foreign policy, if at one time, if you're taking a look at 45 or even in the 1990s, there's a mix of hard power and soft power, of coercion and consent. If U.S. authority now is entirely coercion, that it's not connected in any meaningful way to material benefits, presumption that the US is going to engage in self-constraint, it's really hard to see the US rebuilding its credibility since it operates more or less exclusively through coercion. And then I'd say something else domestically, which is I just don't think that claiming a moral reset and saying we're going to be more like Obama in like the 2010s addresses the depth of what this country is witnessing right now. Like the US is engaged in, I think, what should be a really profound moment of soul searching. So it's not just that like ICE is killing protesters on the streets or disappearing folks. It's not just that we're blockading an entire economy in Cuba, so engaging in like starvation tactics of an entire society. It's not just that the country is engaging in extrajudicial killings in the Pacific and in the Caribbean. It's not just backstopping and complicity in what all legal experts call a genocide in Gaza, or threatening genocidal violence in Iran and engaging in just like the killing of political leaders. That all of this is a dramatic violation of any principle of the rule of law, as well as just like moral judgments about how one is supposed to behave in a world with others. And yet domestically, there really hasn't been a sustained conversation about like what the US is in fact doing. And I worry that if the Democratic response is, we're just going to turn the page on all of that, claim a moral reset, say we're going to go back to 2015 and start behaving in a way that is more constrained, not only will nobody out there buy it, I don't think it'll have the domestic effect. Because unless the country actually has a popular conversation about its behavior, both domestically and internationally, and holds accountable folks during the Trump years, but also before the Trump years, for pretty extreme forms of violence, there's no reason to think that this won't just continue as a perpetual cycle of how American elites behave. Like, you can't just turn the page and imagine a return to some nostalgia, Obama nostalgia, 1990s nostalgia, 1960s nostalgia, without like actually having a sustained transformation in how the American elites engage in decision making and really effectively like what's the appropriate behavior of American elites. And so that means holding folks accountable for acts of violence.
I think that's a really astute point. And I also think another problem with the moral reset argument or prescription that, this is kind of like operated a bit in the background of our conversation, is that it's not just an ideological contest between different worldviews. There is also the material reality of the United States' economic position in the world and the decline of that position since the mid-century period, right? And I think it's easy, just generally in capitalism in the world, it's easy to ignore or paper over or expand past contradictions when everyone is making money, when the pie is expanding. And I think one of the broader stories here of the US in its turn away from multilateralism, in its turn away from consent and leaning heavily on coercion, is the story of deindustrialization, of the economic center of the world shifting away from the United States and shifting away from the West, right? Because part of what makes the consent portion of hegemony attractive to a power that is centrally located in the world economy is that everyone playing by the same rules works when you're in the position of power, right? Because it cements that power. And I think that's part of what we've seen is not just a deviation away from our moral center or what some people thought our moral center was, but fundamental shifts in the world economy that are making an ideological program in which the United States remains at the top of the world system harder and harder to preserve without force alone. And I think that like it gets into this quicksand model of trying to hold on to that hegemonic position.
Yeah, I mean, this gets to, I think, a really significant issue that I'll put it this way, that folks that identify as part of the American left have to grapple with, which is that if you think of the periods in American history where there's been, broadly speaking, a commitment to greater forms of economic egalitarianism and political inclusion. These have been periods in which, because of a backdrop basically of empire in different forms, there's been an expanding pie. So if you read, for instance, Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century, like his book, like one of the things that he mentions but doesn't give an explanation for is that in Europe in the mid-19th century, there's way more socioeconomic inequality than there is in the US. But there's like a reason why that's the case in the US, which is that the US is organized as like, one of the central sort of structuring dynamics of 19th century United States is that it's a very particular kind of settler project. So it's a project of Anglo and then European settlers who have a very rich and vibrant tradition of internal democracy, political participation, economic independence through property ownership. But as a condition of that, not only do you need like the coerced labor of what end up being enslaved African peoples, but you also need access to land. And so it's native expropriation and it's territorial expansion that plays a central role in sustaining greater forms of economic equality, in providing a safety valve when it comes to internal class conflicts. That, let's say you're landless in one setting, that there's always the possibility, real or unreal, of being able to move migration as a mechanism of being able to sustain internal equality among Euro-American settlers. That plays a powerful role in shaping largesse domestically, and it has an effect. It's one of the reasons why you have universal white manhood suffrage in the US. It's one of the reasons why you have certain kinds of anti-aristocratic traditions that emerge and have such power in mid-19th century American life. And then you can make a very similar story about the mid-20th century under very different kinds of conditions, which is the effect of World War II is to devastate the European imperial system and to leave the United States as absolutely globally dominant, not just when it comes to the military and politics, but also economically. And it produces a condition in which the US enjoys dollar hegemony. So its currency is the world currency. It's able to open up all of these global markets. And so really the story of the mid-20th century is the story of a new kind of frontier under very different types of circumstances for American resources, assets. And one of the things that happens as an effect of that is that you absolutely have, like rising economic opportunity within the US. And it's against that backdrop that you also then have a set of policies in the mid-20th century that not only sustain a social welfare state, but that also are the background for why you have greater rights and protection provided to racial minorities. So it's not a coincidence that the civil rights movement finally succeeds at a time of like a growing domestic pie. But again, it's not all, but it's partially sustained by another version of empire. That like the American story really has been that the times you see, and I'm using this as just a catch-all, like social democracy strongest have been times when American imperial power has been strongest and expanding. And in a way, like the challenge for the president of the left is that as a matter of like cultural status, ideas, because of the failures of the last half century, left ideas that combine social democracy, broadly speaking, and anti-imperialism are probably more present in the US than they've been in a century, like if we're being honest about it, since like basically the 1930s. But under kind of structural circumstances in which the institutions of the left, like labor, are weaker than they've been, perhaps ever, but then also in which the kind of classic combination of American economic largesse, growth, that sustained various forms of inclusion and social democracy really aren't present. And I think it's part of that contradiction why the kind of far right's version of a turn against the mid-century compact also has a substantial base. I should say, I don't think that the right's base is even the largest plurality in the US. And it's basically over-indexed politically because of the anti-democratic natures of American institutions. But its vitality is also a function of precisely a kind of predicament that the left faces.
I definitely want to get to how we think we might breach this impasse on the left, because I do think that is the central political challenge of our time. But first, I want to go back in history a bit, because you just briefly in that last answer mentioned two different moments in American history, two different versions of this mechanism by which expansion creates the space for the type of inclusion that is viewed as progressive or part and parcel of US national identity. You picked out the middle of the 19th century when that mechanism was defined by territorial expansion on the continent, providing the larger pie through which the freedom of the settler can be realized. And you talked about the mid-century moment when US's expanded position in the world and the construction of a global empire raised the standard of living and provided the means by which, once again, that kind of inclusion could be realized. And I wanted to actually hone in on what I view as kind of the hinge point between those two different mechanisms. And that's to focus on this really fascinating period in US history following the Civil War and Reconstruction and the closing of the continental frontier, and that moment at which the US really starts to turn outwards and globalize its imperial ambitions. And this happens with the Spanish-American War, but then very acutely in the war in the Philippines, where perhaps for the first time, but certainly not the last, the US is applying some of the lessons on a military level that it learned on the frontier to try and suppress a guerrilla insurgency overseas. And I have been very fascinated with this moment in history just for the past several years, in part because, you have some of the figures from the Indian Wars then go out and literally apply the lessons themselves in the form of Teddy Roosevelt. But the other reason I find it interesting is because in reading about the Philippines and the US's counterinsurgency strategies in the Philippines as a part of that project, I see a lot of resonances with the strategies used to suppress the insurgency in Gaza today in terms of the concentration of populations and control over the means of subsistence in terms of aid. And all of this may be getting, a bit afield from what we're talking about, but I really appreciated the section in your book on the Philippines where you talked about that moment of transition from the kind of settler republic national identity towards starting to view the Constitution as a mandate for thinking about American power on the global stage and across a global domain. So yeah, I don't know if you have thoughts to share about that particular moment and how you approached it as a scholar and how you view it in terms of the development of the U.S. national project.
Yeah, a lot to say. So the first thing is, so I study, my scholarly life, I study the U.S. Constitution and American political development more generally. And I've just been struck by the extent to which so much of the scholarship and really the political commentary too is exclusively an internal story. So it's just about, what are viewed as internal political conflicts, development. So you can tell the story of American constitutional development that goes from the founding to the Civil War to the 1930s to the 60s to the present, and tell it without ever mentioning the question of American expansion, the U.S.'s overseas role, the forms of empire that exist even within its borders, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things that's striking to me about this is the fact that as somebody that's just lived through the last 25 years, and we've already had a conversation like this, if you were to tell the story of the rise of Trump, for instance, without ever mentioning the Iraq War, I think that would be, it would just be a farcically poor analysis, because the truth of the matter is that a significant part of how Trump was able to claim control over the Republican Party was by opposing, in the context of that 2016 election cycle, the war, being the anti-war candidate, and through that basically destroying the Bush political dynasty, such that the Iraq War is now viewed among Republicans as this profound political failure. And similarly, I think one of the real reasons why he was able to beat Clinton in 2016, even though he lost the popular vote, like one of the reasons why he had such support vis-a-vis Clinton is that Clinton was read as the pro-war candidate. So that these dynamics really do have very profound effects. Similarly, I think if you were to tell the story of our current moment in American politics, let's say the rise of Mamdani, of institutions like the DSA, and not mention Palestine at all, like that would essentially be to ignore one of the significant conditions under which we're getting the political present. And I think that that's just a story that's operative across American history precisely because of the way in which the U.S., has always been engaged in various forms of external projections of power that are directly tied to internal notions of membership. And so the argument that like I kind of make about what's going on in the Philippines, and so I see the Philippines as a really decisive moment and a hinge moment in thinking about the future of American politics, is that it's the war in the Philippines takes place at a moment in time after the closing of the frontier, where there's no new land, there's growing internal class conflict. So there's precisely the kinds of internal problems over whether or not there's a reducing economic pie. And you have more and more figures like Teddy Roosevelt, as well as folks that have been connected to various wars of expansion against native peoples that say, well, there's a natural response to this, which is territorial expansion overseas, that the U.S. should become an empire just like all of the other European empires, like England, like France, and claim its own colonies. And the Spanish-Cuban-American War, for a variety of complicated reasons, ends up becoming a staging ground for this. In the wake of the war, the U.S. finds itself in control of both Puerto Rico and the Philippines. And very quickly, an argument that's made by annexationists vis-a-vis the Philippines is that this should be a stage for the U.S. now developing these like global colonies, and that the war in the Philippines to suppress what's an emergent, indigenous, so like anti-colonial response by Filipinos declaring their own independent republic is effectively a race war, which is it's a war of asserting Euro-American kind of civilizational dominance and permanent imperial control. The problem is that the U.S. is a late comer to the colonial scramble for land. And so pretty quickly it becomes apparent that the idea of just holding all of these territories has massive downsides at a time in which many of the most prized possessions are gone. And also the U.S. is facing an intense global anti-colonial resistance movement because this is now increasingly an era of non-white political assertiveness. And just as a condition of being able to maintain some control on the ground in places like the Philippines, what the U.S. has to do is hand over power to various kinds of local elites, sort of wealthy families, sort of engage in mediated forms of self-rule. And this, of course, raises a question in the first decade of the 20th century, which is, well, why is it that the U.S. should be in this project at all if it's so hard to hold territory, and just as a condition of holding territory, it has to give power back? And what emerges over the course of the first 2 decades of the 20th century, and it's notable that it starts really in the Republican Party, because the Republican Party has its own anti-slavery legacies from the Civil War, arguments about the U.S. as standing for the principle of universal liberty for all, the Constitution fulfilling the principles of the Declaration. What starts to emerge is this idea that, well, wait a second, actually, U.S. power is different than the old European powers. What U.S. power does is it's not interested in permanent colonies. What it's interested in is reconstructing societies that for various reasons are not as kind of culturally developed on terms of market capitalism and sort of constitutional representative government, So serving as tutors for less quote unquote developed peoples. And then when those peoples are ready for independence, then they can become independent and part of a global world. And the reason why the US is attuned for playing this role is because the US is not like the other empires. It's not actually interested in extraction. It's interested in promoting this principle of constitutionalism. And so the US in 1916 under Wilson, so now it's Wilson, Democrat, start to really kind of develop these ideas where the US is one of the very first European powers that goes on record saying that the Philippines will eventually get independence. That doesn't actually happen ultimately for another 30 years. But nonetheless, there's this like emergent idea that US power is distinct from the other European powers. And it takes really a set of, sustained political struggles, both internationally, 2 world wars. But this becomes the foundation of how the US understands its role in the world by the time we get to World War II and certainly the post-war period, which is the Philippines both becomes an anachronism, and Puerto Rico too, like this idea that you actually need to hold territory. So this is not something that the US ends up replicating in a more extensive way, but it also becomes a precursor in the transformation of understanding American empire as about a kind of, like a settler polity now on the global march, creating colonial dependencies abroad, to rather this notion of a liberal hegemon that oversees a world in which everybody under its tutelage is ultimately supposed to get self-government, but on terms consistent with American interests. But that's okay, because American interests are the world's interests. And you can see this transformation even play out in somebody like Teddy Roosevelt, who during the Spanish-Cuban-American War, the beginning of the war against the Philippines, is very much talking in terms of racial domination. By the time you get to the eve of World War I, he's saying, even a place like Japan deserves to have its own sphere of influence. He had sent some portion of the Pacific Fleet to Australia and New Zealand when Japan defeated Russia in 2004-05 to say that, just like the US, those places are also white man's country. A decade later, he's starting to sort of reconstruct even his own idea of what American power means in a world that is overwhelmingly non-white.
And you also see a kind of similar contradiction or transition in Woodrow Wilson, in his ascent from avowed segregationist proponent of lost cause of the Confederacy to proponent of, quote unquote, self-determination on the world stage.
Yeah. And it's because, and this is another thing that we can think about with 21st century American politics, that Wilson combines an argument about the fact that all peoples have a right to self-determination. And some of that comes out of his own views about the South as a defeated people that are denied their form of self-determination through Reconstruction, with an argument that there is a hierarchy of peoples that are more and less developed, and that, Europeans and Americans stand atop it, but Asians and Africans are at the bottom. And so that everybody is entitled to self-determination, but not everybody can actually effectuate it in the here and now. And so that's why you need US supervision. Now, from the outside looking in the context of mandate system and interventions in Haiti and elsewhere, this just looks like old-fashioned European empire. If you're somebody across the global South, but it's notable that it's a different kind of justification for American power. And it's also why Wilson is somebody that on the one hand defends Jim Crow, but on the other hand has this idea about there might be some long story about preparation for less developed, quote unquote, peoples domestically. And these ideas do not disappear, but they kind of play out in different ways, in different iterations at various moments in American history, even as the larger ideological formations shift. So you can tell a kind of story, for instance, about contemporary sort of Trumpist foreign policy that combines this thought. Well, part of the reason why the US should be more restrained or turn back to its sphere of influence, allow places like China and Russia to have their own spheres, is that, like, all peoples are kind of entitled through some power politics machinations to potentially have their spheres of influence. Different civilizations can have different kinds of controls. While at the same time, there's this very clear idea of a hierarchy and of a kind of ethno-national dominance for Euro-Americans, and an idea of the US as a home to a Euro-American people. And so those two things are kind of mixed and married in very specific types of ways.
I wanted to ask about something you were talking about a little bit before, about the nature of these objectives being that all of these countries can have the American style of economic system. They can have all this kind of economic freedom, all this kind of capitalistic freedom, and that is defined as freedom for the country generally. And I'm thinking about that in relation with Iraq and what happened there. And this narrative that began to take hold in the late 2000s, towards the end of Bush's presidency, where there is this accusation from conservative publications that the Iraqis, that the Afghans are ungrateful for the freedom that we have given them. And I'm wondering, for as long as that profession of wanting freedom, of wanting self-determination for other people, as long as that has been a part of American imperialism, how long has that feeling of ungratefulness on the part of the natives, how long has that been part of that as well?
These are very much two sides of the same coin. Though the first thing that I do want to say is I'm of the view that American cultural life, political institutions, identity, membership really changes dramatically in the 20th century and the mid-20th century. In other words, like, the US is a fundamentally different type of polity than it was 100 years ago. And that these 3 decades between the 1930s with the New Deal, World War II, Cold War, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, Medicare, they really do have this effect of reshaping the terms of American life. And one of the things that it does is that folks, by the time you get to the end of the 20th century in both parties, so this is McCain and George Bush Jr. and Obama, why frankly Obama and George Bush Jr. seem to get along so well, they actually authentically share an idea about the country. Like, this is not just sort of like a cynical, pose about the relationship between the US and the rest of the world. They are authentically invested in the story of the US, as committed to the principle of equal liberty for all, as the achievements of the mid-20th century, as the fulfillment of a story that goes all the way back to the Declaration and the Constitution. I mean, these are all the things, frankly, just from attending a No Kings rally, that would be familiar. And that what the US is doing overseas is fulfilling that project. Like, when Bush Jr. is like, let freedom ring in the context of the Iraq War, like, that's a perspective that he holds as an authentic ideological commitment. And it's, I think, one of the reasons why there is such kind of vitriol and anger from what you can think of as like the political center against some of the tendencies in the Trump administration, like the getting rid of the USAID, the rejection of the language of democracy, sort of the open embrace of authoritarianism, because it feels like a deep assault on how folks have understood the way that they've like organized, frankly, like their own lives, their own sense of political identity. There has been this profound romance. And that romance, I think, it should be noted, has also had pretty positive effects. Like, I think it's part of the story of how American identity and membership changed so dramatically, how you got a place where you had immigration reforms in 1965 that included, open up immigration to places, Asia and Africa, even as it imposed, I think, pretty ultimately disastrous policies for the Western Hemisphere. So anyway, this is to say that there is like authentic commitment. But if you are genuinely committed to the idea that what you're doing is expanding human rights, like I remember reading a New Yorker article in the context of the Iraq War where Bush was being asked about human rights violations. And he says, all this talk about human rights violations that the US is engaged in. There's been no president besides me that's done more for human rights. No American president's done more. And the reason why he believed that is because he was invested in this story about the US spreading democracy and freedom. But if in practice, because the idea of the spread of American democracy freedom goes hand in hand with the imposition of US security objectives, and again, specifically for the Middle East, we can think about various kinds of objectives around energy resources, containing Iran, backing Israel, et cetera, are pretty profoundly inconsistent with what people on the ground want, then it produces this conflict. And it leads to precisely this kind of question, which is, why is it, if we're operating out of our own sort of sense of a kind of romantic mission or project, why is it that folks are rejecting on the ground our directives? It can only be a kind of cultural flaw or weakness. And so you see this play out across the 20th century in case after case. But then I think specifically one of the things that it did, again, when it came to American politics on the right, in the way that the right had its own sort of narrative about what went wrong with the Iraq War, especially against the backdrop of really the kind of collapse, broadly speaking, of the US mid-century project, is that the argument increasingly was not just the late 2000s argument, which is they're ungrateful. It's like the fact that they're ungrateful says something inherent about the internal limitations of the people. And it means that the US should not engage in nation building projects, period. So that the US might still have to engage in belligerent violence. We might have to, kill, assassinate leaders, kidnap people, drop bombs. But we should not be in the business of the kind of projects that one had associated with American interventions, which is like this kind of reconstructive project. And so it's not a surprise that if you look, for instance, at, when you see spikes in anti-Muslim attacks, et cetera, in the US, like there's a long period post 9/11 where that really declines, but then it comes back 2015, 2016 in the context of really the rise of Trump and the Republican Party's own sort of determination that the lack of gratitude is an indicator of the limitations of the people themselves, why you have to have things like a Muslim ban, and how that's now played out in contemporary foreign policy with the Republican Party, where the central argument that's given from Hegseth to Colby to you name it about what distinguishes Trump's forever war with Iran with previous forever wars is it's not nation building, because it does not presume this story about all peoples being able to equally sort of ultimately share in a liberal capitalist constitutional model. And so you've now reached a point where like the right is effectively fully defected from the story. And to the extent that the center left still seems attached to it, it's attached with a kind of like naivete that we discussed, that somehow you can just turn back the clock to some earlier moment where the internal contradictions between rule following and rule defection won't be so extreme. But, that's just a kind of impossibility at present.
I think it's worth mentioning, and you write about this in your book, The Constitutional Bind, that there have also been attempts at left defection from the romantic vision of freedom as a founding ideal of US national identity. And I want to actually read from something that I found online, which is kind of draft document produced during the Black Panther Party's Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention. And this was an attempt at really engaging in a political reclamation of US national identity, of the Constitution itself, that sought to reject those contradictions inherent in the historical nature of what American freedom has always meant. And so they had a section on internationalism. I just want to read from their preamble because I found it really incredible. So this is from the Workshop on Internationalism and Relations with Liberation Struggles Around the World. Quote, "In order to ensure our international constitution, we, the people of Babylon, declare an international Bill of Rights, that all people are guaranteed the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, that all people of the world be free from dehumanization and intervention in their internal affairs by a foreign power. Therefore, if fascist actions in the world attempt to achieve imperialist goals, they will be in violation of the law and dealt with as criminals. We are in full support with the struggle of the Palestinian people for liberation of Palestine from Zionist colonialism and their goals of creating a democratic state where all Palestinian Jews, Christians, and Muslims are equal. And I'm skipping a little bit. We propose that whereas the universities in the United States are used by the imperialist system to provide the knowledge that the system uses to perpetrate the exploitation of the third world and repression against national liberation struggles, we propose that the universities and their resources be turned over to use for, by, and of the peoples of the world so that they may implement their vision of a new socialist world. And then it has a list of stated commitments. And the first one is number 1, the United States is an international federation of bandits, and we denounce its rights to nationhood. I am just so fascinated by this, in part because it seems to be an attempt to break through that contradiction of the inherent meaning of freedom as tied to US nationhood, but also through its repurposing of the language of the Constitution. And I'm curious what you make of that. I mean, is it a possibility, if we think about the political impasses of today, for a kind of, in the mold of the Panthers at this time, this was written in 1970, for a left defection from the romantic vision of American freedom that we've been talking about?
Yeah, I think there's a lot there. So the first thing that I'd say is that I really appreciated that you noted the ways in which it both is engaging with sort of discourses of American freedom and is also a pretty profound break from how we typically see folks talking about the national project, that those two things are present at the same time. And to me, I think one of the things that highlights is that my own view is that ideas of freedom and subordination are just kind of inherently joined within societies, and that folks kind of make sense or develop notions of freedom out of their existing conditions of subordination. And they also engage with the narratives of freedom that exist on the ground. So that here what you're getting from the Panthers is an invocation of the Declaration, but of the Declaration as saying that there is a shared American idea of we the people, of government as ultimately responsible to those that consent, and that if governments engage in various forms of oppression, that there's a legitimate right to reconstruct those governments on terms of freedom for all. And so it's asserting a kind of continuity with that tradition. And then notice the other thing. This was part of a constitution writing project, which is this was a mass effort in 1970 as a counter-Constitution Day event in September in Philadelphia. So it's held at Temple University, where thousands of delegates were there. There's, thousands more were outside, where the Panthers and a whole range of organizations, including both folks that were representatives of domestic left-wing organizations as well as international anti-colonial groups, including, I think, representatives from the PLO, that were present at the event. And then they divided up into working groups. They wrote various bits. And the reason why it's significant to note that they're writing a constitution, because it also suggests the idea that this is supposed to be part of a persuasive effort ultimately to be able to build connections, not just within Black life, but across various types of constituencies in the US, to produce something like a type of multiracial commitment to reconstructing on kind of legally responsible grounds a new kind of polity. And so that's all, I think, highlighting the ways in which you have even what we think of as radically rejectionist groups on the left in the US that are attempting to take advantage of the cultural resources that exist for making broad arguments about social change, but then reconstituting them in ways that are responsive to their own experience and their own analysis of the world. And here, the reconstitution is looking at 1970 and saying part of any genuine transformation in the US has to be a rejection of its own both past and ongoing imperial heritage. And that means thinking seriously about redistribution that's not just domestic, that's international, engages in various forms of reparations, takes on board a kind of colonial accounting, and that connects a reconstructed American state project to efforts globally to expand the potential for equal and effective freedom for all. And so it's both combining the resources that exist, but then also trying to transform those resources in ways that are responsive to the problems of the present in that moment in time, and that combine an account of freedom for those oppressed domestically to an anti-imperial agenda generally. In a way, I think the problem that the Panthers faced in the early 1970s is not that different than the problem that we see at present, which is the Panthers really had no pathway to building a majority around those views. Like just even independent of, yes, they faced like massive violence and crackdown. They're framed as, lawless despite having their leaders assassinated like Fred Hampton. But at a moment in time in which there was sort of declining working class commitment to even like the New Deal project from the 30s and 40s, the nature of American politics meant that there was no plausible majority for the combination that they were imagining of an anti-imperialism that really is profoundly redistributive and away, frankly, from the American metropole, alongside dramatic changes to the internal national identity. And what that ended up doing, I think, is that over the course of the next decade for the party, it meant that there were two other tendencies that ended up dominating. The most common tendency within the party that ends up taking over is this idea of you retreat to the local. And so you focus on providing local services to your community in Oakland, for instance. And that's actually where most of the party, especially under Elaine Brown, ended up going. But then it also produced this other element, which was a smaller branch of it, which is you have to basically abandon the idea of building a transformative majority through persuasion. Like in some ways, the effort at having a Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention, of working together collectively to produce a document like this, which ends up being abandoned under various kinds of pressures, is a sort of like a last moment in thinking about whether or not you could have a popular front that combines social democracy and anti-imperialism. And instead, what you end up getting is these sort of offshoots that embrace violence and the idea that you can it's another version of romanticism. Like you can romantically connect to third world guerrilla struggles and reproduce that in the US, which I view as both a profound moral failure and also just a political failure because it's not a viable option. But it's a moral failure because it essentially rejects the idea that like persuasion can be a basis for, in fact, building a durable political coalition, and so devolves into various kinds of violent fantasies. And in a way, like that structural predicament, I think, is one that we're also, this is sort of another version of the conversation that we had earlier that we can think about for the present, that like we're some ways back at this moment where that was during the high tide of Vietnam. When the Vietnam War kind of dissipated, so too did the energy behind a certain type of anti-imperialist politics. We're now also, because of the politics around Palestine and Iran and Venezuela and Lebanon and Cuba, the question of American empire has a type of prominence, and we're thinking about whether or not you can combine social democracy for all with anti-imperialism. And there's a real substantial base. But then there's the question of, to what extent can you build a majority that's transformative around that base? And how can that majority, if it were to be built, operate within the terms of the US's own constitutional system that places massive constraints on the capacity of majorities to exercise power? I think the thing that's available now that was not available then is I actually just think because of the profound changes over the last half century that we discussed and the collapse of the politics of the center, including the collapse in various ways of the Mid-Century Compact, there is just way more support as a mass political fact for this particular kind of combination. You can see it in somebody like Mamdani, where the idea of a person that embraces third worldism and anti-colonialism becoming the mayor of the unofficial capital of the United States, inconceivable, like certainly inconceivable in the early 1970s, inconceivable just a couple years ago. So there is a kind of mass base, but then there's the problem of the US's constitutional system, its institutional structures, and how that inhibits the political exercise of that base. And then there's also that like larger kind of structural impediment about what to do in a global economic context that's marked by such heightened forms of inequality, and also what feels much more like a shrinking pie, where I think any truthful version of anti-imperialism has to be honest that it includes, as the Panthers were explicit, some version of global redistribution. Like it's not that there are actual, not just symbolic benefits, there are actual material benefits of things like dollar hegemony, US primacy, that some range of Americans actually get. And so you have to be able to navigate that question. The kind of concrete way that you see this sort of rubber meets the road is around immigration, where right now, for the first time in a really long time, Trump is deeply underwater on immigration policy. There's American revulsion against the kind of violence that the US is engaged in, not just at the border, but within its own communities with respect to non-citizens. But at the same time, there's still a kind of enduring problem, which is to what extent can a society of insiders that have benefited from a particular set of frameworks be willing, not just out of moral largesse, out of a sense of solidarity and commitment, to expand the boundaries of membership and inclusion to folks that are on the outside. The US has done it at various moments in time, but it's still an incredibly kind of tough question for its viability and possibility right now.
Yeah, I mean, I know we have to close that, but I do want to push back on the idea, to the extent that you're saying that a politics that internationalizes the question of revolutionary subjectivity or political subjectivity represents inherently a moral failing. That's like a moral choice, as opposed to downstream of potentially a structural analysis of the precise limitations that you're naming. And I guess what I want to offer is that there is something that can kind of sit between those two poles, that is still recognizes the potential of international subjectivity and the need to break that mechanism of expansion and inclusion, that is still a majoritarian project. And I think you're right to point to immigration as the nexus of those things, because the issue of immigration, I think, rightly recognizes the centrality of the world to America in this moment. I do think, though, that the issue of relying on persuasion and ultimately some form of noblesse oblige in terms of expanding that pie out and opening the bounds of citizenship is profoundly limited if the means of that transformation are contained by citizenship itself through a kind of like electoralism, et cetera. So I guess I take it as one of the projects of this show, want to be able to think about political subjectivity and majoritarianism in a way that crosses across those lines of citizenship. And that necessarily, I think, will involve a kind of internationalism. And I agree that there has to be a way to de-romanticize the question of connections between oppressed groups in the United States, which may remain in a minoritarian posture, and the victims of American empire abroad. But I refuse to morally exclude a vision of political transformation in which those victims of American empire are not part of that transformation itself.
Thank you for that clarification, because I don't believe that we disagree on this. So I should say, my own view is that the only kind of emancipatory politics really ultimately in the US, and then also thinking globally, is one that has to be committed to a version of left internationalism. Because in truth, even though I've been emphasizing the material benefits that were accrued domestically through projects of empire, it's also the case that it's precisely these projects of empire that have produced massive global inequalities as well as political inequalities here in the United States. And that I think that ultimately equal and effective freedom domestically entails a profoundly different world, and that a world that's organized on multipolar terms, that's authentically committed to self-determination, that treats the global commons as a site of solidarity available to all, that's invested in the notion of mutual constraint and rule following that all abide by, is like the actual path to freedom in the US, freedom globally. And, this I think leads to kind of like a few different responses. One is that I think like the domestic task in the US is sort of like twofold. Institutionally, it's to build the kind of intermediate meaning-making institutions that make these ideas just authentically, organically real for more and more people. So it's just part of like the cultural life of, what it means to be members of specific workplaces and neighborhoods and communities. And I think this is actually one of the real profound successes actually of institutions like the DSA, but we can think of a whole variety of others. And that means a project, it's a political project. It doesn't just have to operate electorally. It can operate through direct actions at the workplace. There's a variety of different mechanisms. It can operate through mass mobilization, civil disobedience, you name it. That's about creating popular power and pressure around these views domestically. And that's a kind of medium to long-term project. I think domestically, it also has a second element, which I spoke about before, which is that a central politics of the here and now in 2027, and then certainly in 2029, has to be an American moral accounting with the forms of violence that the state has been complicit in. Like the American story, we can tell this going back to like the era of settler expansion. We can tell it going back to the beginning of the Cold War or post 9/11, is one of absolute state impunity for acts of state violence from the president down to the police officer. And unless that impunity ends and that there's a real conversation, not just about Trump, but also about the folks that preceded Trump, including the Biden administration, about impunity for state violence, the US is inevitably going to be in a place in which it's proceeding again and again through a kind of destructive combination of elite power and imperial coercion. And I actually think that conversation about confronting state impunity probably right now has a broader potential base. Like it's a kind of thing that you can imagine a type of popular front emerging around. And so those two strike me as really important domestic elements of a project about making internationalism and internationalist commitments really entrenched parts of American life. But then it also connects to the international. And this is maybe part of where I was going, which is if you're a person of the left in the United States, I think, there's been a way of imagining the US. Because the US is at the metropolitan center, the thought is that the US left projects have to be at the center of global transformation. And that what the US left does is like the leading edge of transformation generally. And I think because of the power of the American state, there's a huge responsibility for the US left because of what the state can do. And in part, probably because of, the importance of constraining the state from engaging in deleterious practices. But my own view is that, we just do not have tons of examples of imperial centers unilaterally choosing to abandon their imperial standing. And in a way, the thing that the left is asking is something that would be truly exceptional. That doesn't mean it should not be the project, but there needs to be a kind of recognition that it's asking for a kind of transformation in the meaning of the American state that cuts against these various types of structural conditions, and that probably suggests that the likely leadership of global internationalism will come from outside the US. And that part of what the left project has to be is about having a concrete agenda for American domestic politics, but also working in solidarity, alliance, and thinking about the transnational institutions of the left and rebuilding those institutions which have been compromised and undermined just as the institutions domestically have been rebuilt. Because the global story is also one of the defeat in various ways of anti-colonial movements, the transformation of anti-colonial leaders into authoritarians, the rise of new forms of authoritarianism across the global South, and a combination of sometimes in alliance with the US, sometimes not, of new varieties of authoritarianism and imperialism. And so effectively, what the goal is to think about how you can produce or be part of a genuinely transnational left that is both consistently anti-authoritarian and anti-imperial, and that, of course, links back in various ways to the domestic politics here in the US.
I think that is as good a place as any to wrap it up. Professor Aziz Rana, thank you so much for your time. This was a really fascinating conversation. I feel like we could have gone on another couple of hours, but we are not going to subject you to that.
Thanks so much for having me on the show.